He stood trial like a criminal, yet all he ever did was protect a little girl. Max, a retired K9 German Shepherd, was moments away from being taken from the world, until a child's whisper in court changed everything. This is the story of a town divided, a mother rediscovering faith, and a dog who quietly stayed when no one else would. But what happened after the courtroom verdict is what truly stunned the nation. What did Max do next that turned him into a legend? The morning air in Willow Creek carried a strange tension, one that settled not just on the courthouse steps, but on every coffee cup in every diner, on every newspaper, at every doorstep, on every whisper that passed from clerk to clerk in the town's modest government building. This wasn't just any hearing, and everyone knew it. For a place where court sessions typically resolved small property disputes or parking violations, what was about to unfold in the courthouse that day felt more like something torn from the pages of a legal drama. Except the accused this time walked on 4 legs. Max sat still in the front of the courtroom, his thick coat of sable and tan gleaming faintly beneath the filtered light streaming through the high windows. His ears stood upright, not from nervousness, but from the finely tuned discipline that had once defined his service. He didn't fidget or whimper, didn't scan the room anxiously like any other dog might. He sat beside Officer Evan Ross, silent and alert, eyes calm, but unwavering like a sentinel who still believed he had a duty, even now, even here. Max was not just any German Shepherd. For 8 years, he had served the Lincoln County Sheriff's Department with unwavering loyalty, known for his calm under pressure, his remarkable scent-tracking ability, and the kind of instinctive bravery that couldn't be trained into just any dog. His presence had led to missing children being found, dangerous fugitives being subdued, and countless moments of community reassurance. There were people in Willow Creek who still remembered the night he pulled a wounded deputy out of a ditch after a car crash, refusing to leave his side until help arrived. In town lore, Max wasn't a pet, he was a hero in fur. But that wasn't how everyone saw him anymore. Clint Redford sat across the room from Max, his arm in a sling jaw clenched tightly beneath a face that seemed perpetually pale with resentment. A known figure in Willow Creek, part businessman, part political meddler, Clint had long divided the town's opinion. Some called him successful, others called him dangerous. And on the morning of the trial, Clint's voice had already made its way into 6 news segments, each one painting a picture of a once trusted K9 turned rogue and violent. He claimed Max had attacked him without warning in the town's lakeside park 3 weeks ago. He said he had been walking alone in the early evening when Max, no longer under leash or duty, lunged and bit him severely enough to require 9 stitches and a tetanus shot. His legal team was now pushing for the most severe penalty permitted under the county's animal control laws, euthanasia. Evan Ross sat rigid in his seat, wearing his formal uniform, though it looked slightly more worn than usual. His tie tugged just a little too tight. The silver badge on his chest polished to an almost desperate gleam. His eyes, though, told a deeper story. Sleepless nights, endless preparation, and a heart clenched in defense, not of property or policy, but of someone he had loved like family. For Evan, Max wasn't just a partner from the force. He was the dog who had shared his patrol car every day, who had followed his voice even through smoke and chaos, who had once stood between Evan and an armed suspect without hesitation. Evan knew Max's character the way one knows their own heartbeat, silent, steady, trustworthy. And now to see Max accused of being dangerous, it felt like the world had gone upside down. This dog, Evan had said in an earlier pre-trial hearing, his voice steady but layered with something softer, has spent more of his life protecting people than most people have. He's not violent. He responded to a threat just like he was trained to do. But the complication, the gaping hole in the defense, was the absence of a named victim. There were rumors that a child might have been involved in the park incident, that Max had leapt to intervene when someone else was in danger. Yet no one had come forward. There was no filed report, No video surfaced. Just Clint's accusation and his bandaged arm. The prosecution leaned heavily on this. They presented Max's age 10 going on 11 as evidence that he may have developed unpredictable behavioral changes. They framed him as a liability to public safety, a retired officer who had failed to transition into civilian life, now lashing out. And in a courtroom filled with townspeople, some of whom had grown up admiring Max's service. This narrative wasn't just painful, it was polarizing. Outside the courthouse, the front steps had become a makeshift press center. Local news vans jostled for position tripods anchored onto the cobblestone pavement, while reporters whispered lines into microphones and photographers tried to get the perfect angle of the courtroom door. One outlet dubbed the trial "The Case of the Hero Hound," while another chose the harsher K9 on "Trial Has a Protector Become a Threat." Willow Creek itself felt torn. Some believed Clint's injury was real and warranted concern. Others stood by Max with unwavering support, flooding social media with hashtags like #JusticeForMax and "Hero Deserves Better." Petitions circulated gathering digital signatures that reached into neighboring counties, demanding that the court recognize Max's years of service and let him live peacefully in retirement. But inside the courtroom, none of that noise mattered. The only sound that broke the hush of wood-paneled silence was the occasional tap of a pen, the creak of a bench, or the low hum of the ceiling fans. The judge, a man with graying temples and a reputation for measured logic, sat poised with hands clasped before him, studying both sides with a steady gaze. Max never moved. He didn't react when Clint's lawyer pointed at him, voice rising with accusations. He didn't blink when images of Clint's bandaged arm were displayed on the screen. He didn't flinch when the prosecution insinuated that the town's trust in him had been misplaced nostalgia for a past that no longer existed. Max remained still, his presence both dignified and silently defiant. Evan's gaze flickered once toward Max, a soft ache tugging at his features, and then back to the jury, regular folks from Willow Creek, a mix of teachers, grocers, retirees, and mechanics, people who had likely seen Max on patrol, who maybe even had kids, once patted his head at the farmer's market. He could only hope they still remembered. "Your Honor." Evan's attorney began rising after the prosecution rested. "We acknowledge the seriousness of Mr. Redford's injuries. But we urge the court not to make a decision based on fear or speculation. This is not just a case about an animal attack. It's about what really happened that day, about the circumstances, the instinct, and perhaps even the unseen courage that wasn't reported." He paused, glancing briefly at Max. "We believe there's more to the story." And somewhere in the back of the courtroom, behind a row of silent observers, a woman sat quietly with her young daughter, whose tiny fingers clutched a stuffed animal close to her chest. The little girl's eyes, round and searching, never once left Max. The judge signaled for a brief recess, and the sound of benches scraping against the floor filled the room. People stood stretching legs, murmuring thoughts. Reporters readied their phones. Clint Redford huddled with his lawyer. Evan bent low, rubbing his hand gently behind Max's ear, whispering something only the two of them could understand. And at that moment, Hazel Fields tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered something too quietly, urgently, insistently. The woman blinked, startled, her eyes shifting quickly from her daughter to the dog in the courtroom. And for the first time all morning she leaned forward, her breath held in a way that suggested something long buried had just begun to surface. And in that stillness, something began to shift, not in the law, not yet, but in the air itself, as if the trial was no longer just about what Max had done, but about who had seen it, and who might finally be ready to speak. The courtroom had quieted once again, the low murmur of the recess fading like ripples in a pond after a stone has been dropped. People stretched their legs, moved stiff shoulders, and stepped out for coffee or air, but Nora Field stayed seated. She hadn't come with the intention of doing anything more than observing. She didn't know anyone involved in the case, hadn't spoken to a lawyer, and hadn't prepared a statement. She had simply held her daughter's hand that morning and walked into the courthouse with a strange sense that something might unfold in front of them that needed to be seen. Hazel sat beside her small legs dangling from the bench. A purple dress pressed neatly over her knees, her curly hair pinned back just enough to keep it from falling into her eyes. She clutched a worn plush dog in her arms, one ear half detached, the fur near the nose rubbed thin from years of love. The toy's name was Beans, and it had gone with Hazel everywhere since she could talk. Nora had come mostly to satisfy a question in the back of her mind, the kind that hums quietly for days until it's too loud to ignore. She had seen the article in the local paper the week before retired K9 faces trial after alleged attack in Lakeside Park. And as soon as she saw the photo of Max, something inside her had stilled. There was something about those eyes, that posture, the strength wrapped in calm. She had shown Hazel the article, half expecting the little girl to look for a second and move on. Instead, Hazel had stared, mouth parted just slightly, before whispering, "That's him." Nora hadn't understood. Whose sweetheart Hazel had pointed at the screen. "That's the good boy, the one who helped me at the park." It would have been easy to brush off. Children say things like that all the time, blending memory with dreams, stories with shadows. But Hazel hadn't said it with wonder. She had said it with clarity, as if she remembered not just the dog, but the moment. As if something important had happened, something Nora had perhaps not wanted to look at too closely when it did. And now here they were sitting in the third row of a courtroom, packed with strangers beneath chandeliers that hummed softly above, between two older women who had come just to see the famous K9 everyone was talking about. Max sat silently up front, tail resting neatly along the floor, ears angled forward in attention. And Hazel could not take her eyes off him. "He's so calm," Hazel whispered. Nora glanced down. "Yes, he is." Hazel leaned sideways on the bench, her small hands tightening around the stuffed toy in her lap. He wasn't loud like other dogs, just big and fast. When Nora asked, though her voice was barely there, Hazel didn't hesitate. At the park, with the man who yelled. Nora's chest tensed. It had happened about a month ago at Lakeside Park, near the tall sycamore trees and the winding trail that dipped close to the water's edge. They had gone there one afternoon, Nora intending a quiet walk while Hazel played on the swings. She remembered kneeling to tie her shoe, looking up to see Hazel a few steps ahead, and then chaos. A man had stumbled out from behind the path's corner, voice raised, face red, movements jerky. Nora had screamed her daughter's name and started to run. But something had flashed between them, a blur of fur and motion. She remembered a growl, a bark, and the sight of the man falling back, startled, before sprinting off into the trees. And then a dog standing firmly in front of Hazel, panting, watching, not moving until the man was gone. In the panic, she had scooped Hazel up, heart pounding, and hurried home without asking questions. The entire scene had felt like a bad dream, so fast and strange, she hadn't even thought to call the police. It was only later, curled on the couch with Hazel safe and sound beside her, that the weight of what had happened had begun to settle. But by then the moment had passed, and she convinced herself it had been a stray dog, nothing more. But now, with Hazel staring wide-eyed at the very same German shepherd in this courtroom, the pieces fell into place in ways Nora could no longer ignore. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly, brushing her fingers over Hazel's curls. "That's really the dog you saw." Hazel turned to her, expression solemn in that deeply sincere way only young children can manage. "He jumped in front of me. He barked at the man. And then he chased him a little, but not too far." Nora blinked, lips parted. "And you remember all that?" Hazel nodded. "He didn't bite me. He helped me." The words hung in the air between them, soft and certain. From the front of the room, Max shifted slightly. Not restlessly, but with a quiet purpose, as if adjusting his position to take in something new. Evan, seated beside him, gently rested his hand along Max's back, running his fingers once through the thick fur just behind his collar. The bond between them was palpable, steady, and unbroken even now. Hazel pointed again, whispering, "Look, he's listening." To what Nora asked, her voice hushed with awe. Everything, Hazel replied simply. Nora didn't speak after that. She leaned back slightly in her seat, eyes fixed on the dog who had once stood between her daughter and danger, without asking for thanks or recognition. Her thoughts tumbled fast now. Was this what Evan had been trying to say when he told the court that Max had acted out of instinct? Was this the missing piece of the puzzle that no one had yet been able to prove? Hazel shifted again, rising to her knees on the bench, peeking over the heads in front of her to get a better look. "He's brave," she said. "Like beans, but real." Nora's fingers tightened around Hazel's hand. She could feel her pulse pounding, not from fear, but from the growing realization that they might be the only ones who had seen what no one else had. What if this wasn't just about Max anymore? What if it was about speaking when no one else had? What if it was about standing up for something, even if your voice was small? The door at the front of the room creaked open. The bailiff stepped in, calling for everyone to return to their seats. The recess was ending. Hazel sat down again, still holding Beans tightly, her eyes never once leaving Max. The dog remained still, but there was something in the way he turned his head just slightly, as if he knew someone was watching him with a kind of understanding that couldn't be explained, only felt. Nora leaned down, her lips close to Hazel's ear. "Sweetheart," she whispered, "tell me again. What did the man look like? The one from the park?" Hazel wrinkled her brow, thinking. He was loud, his jacket was dirty. He had something shiny in his hand. I didn't like his eyes. Nora's breath caught. "You didn't tell me that before." Hazel shrugged gently. "You were scared?" The honesty of that answer struck deeper than anything else could have. She had been scared of what could have happened. Scared of what had almost happened, scared of acknowledging how close they'd come to something irreversible. And now her daughter, just 3 years old, was ready to speak the truth that had been buried in both their hearts. As the room filled once again and the judge took his seat, Nora's heart beat with a new rhythm, not just the pulse of anxiety, but the thrum of decision. She didn't know the legal protocols. She didn't know if a toddler's memory would matter in a courtroom built on documents and statements and evidence. But she knew what she had seen in her daughter's face: conviction. And she knew what Max had done. In the front row, Max turned slightly again, just enough that his gaze seemed to find the third bench. His eyes met Hazel's. Neither blinked. Hazel raised her little hand, barely a wave more, a silent salute. And Max, without moving his head, gave a single thump of his tail on the courtroom floor. Nora didn't need anything more. She sat up straighter, wrapped Hazel's fingers in her own, and when the bailiff stepped past again, she gently tugged at his sleeve. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady now. I think my daughter saw what really happened that day." And as the bailiff turned and the courtroom murmurs began to rise again, Hazel looked back at Max with something bright in her eyes, something no accusation could dull. "He's the good boy," she whispered. "I remember." And from that quiet moment between a little girl and a dog who once stood between her and fierce, something shifted in the rhythm of the trial. Something that would echo louder than any gavel. Something that was just beginning to find its voice. The hallway outside the courtroom was buzzing. Reporters lined the walls with phones pressed to their ears, their voices low and quick, recapping what little had happened so far. Court clerks huddled near water fountains. Legal aides shuffled papers in briefcases. And through the noise, through the tightly woven tension that hung in the corridor like summer humidity before a storm, Nora Fields moved with her daughter Hazel, hand in hand, each step slow but certain. She had just done something she never imagined she would. She had spoken to the bailiff. Now, with her heart climbing up her throat and her nerves barely contained beneath her cardigan, she was being led to the defense team's bench. Evan Ross turned at the sound of approaching footsteps. His eyes were tired, rimmed with the soft red of someone who had spent too many nights turning over fears in silence. He hadn't expected anyone to approach him during the recess, and certainly not a woman with a toddler clinging to her side. "Excuse me," Nora said gently, her voice quieter than the rustle of legal pads. "My name is Nora Fields. I think my daughter might be the child your dog protected." The words stopped everything. One of the defense attorneys, a gray-suited man with deep lines around his mouth, lowered his folder. Evan stood straighter, his eyes darting between Nora and the little girl who now peeked out from behind her mother's side, clutching a stuffed toy in one hand and blinking with wide, knowing eyes. Hazel stepped forward on her own. "That's the good boy," she said softly, pointing to Max, who remained seated beside Evan, calm and regal, his gaze steady. The attorney knelt down to eye level with Hazel, his voice taking on the softness reserved for questions you want to believe. "You saw Max before, sweetheart?" Hazel nodded slowly. "He saved me from the loud man." Nora's voice faltered for a moment. "I didn't know what it was at the time," she confessed, "but now it all makes sense. She's been talking about him for weeks. I think he stopped something that day. I just didn't know who he was." The attorney exchanged a look with Evan, who said nothing, only slowly crouched to place a gentle hand on Max's back. Max's ears twitched alert, but still. He was listening, everyone was. Within minutes, word reached the judge's clerk. There was no time to file a full motion, no time to pull together affidavits or notarized statements. But after a short, urgent exchange in the judge's chamber, something unexpected happened. A decision was made. Something unprecedented, unplanned, and undeniably human. The judge granted a supervised interaction between Hazel and Max to take place right then in the courtroom before the next session resumed. It would not be testimony. There would be no cameras, no interviews, no interruptions, just a moment. One moment to allow something outside of law and logic to unfold. The courtroom was cleared and quieted. The gallery filled again row by row. Whispers gave way to silence. Even the journalists stood still, pens lowered, unsure if they were witnessing procedure or history. The judge returned to his bench, solemn but not distant. His robe brushed gently along the polished wood as he sat nodding toward the bailiff. And then the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Hazel stepped through first, wearing the same purple dress from earlier, her curls bouncing slightly with each step. Nora followed behind, slower, her hand briefly resting on Hazel's back as if anchoring the moment in place. At the front, Max sat calmly, his leash loose in Evan's hands. The dog watched Hazel without moving eyes, dark but soft, his chest rising and falling in slow, steady rhythm. No one spoke. No one even breathed too loudly. Hazel reached the center of the courtroom and paused just a few feet from Max. Her stuffed dog Beans was tucked under one arm. Her other hand rose slowly, hesitantly, then dropped again to her side as if unsure how to begin. Evan gave Max a gentle cue, barely a whisper. "It's okay, boy." Max shifted his weight but remained seated. His gaze never left Hazel. Then Hazel stepped forward. One step, two. She lowered herself into a crouch just close enough that her knees brushed the polished floor. Her small body bar dwarfed by the towering form of the retired K9. The moment felt stretched by something unseen. No rustle of papers, no creak of a bench. Just silence, thick and humming with anticipation. Hazel reached out her hand, small fingers round knuckles, a single scrape on her elbow. and laid it gently on Max's snout. Max blinked, slow and deliberate, and then closed his eyes. A breath left the room. No one moved. And then Hazel leaned forward, her mouth near his ear, and whispered something so quietly that not even Nora, standing barely 10 feet away, could hear. Max's ears flicked once. Then he shifted downward slowly, carefully, until his front legs stretched before him, and his head lowered gently into Hazel's lap. A sound, part gasp, part sigh, rose from the back of the courtroom. Nora's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide, brimming. Evan stared, lips slightly parted, his hand loose around the leash, now resting on the floor. And Hazel. She sat still, completely at peace, her fingers curled softly around Max's ear, her eyes focused only on the dog in front of her, as if the rest of the world had faded away. It was a picture that no legal argument could match, no cross-examination could undo. A child, a dog, a bond. No further explanation needed. After nearly a minute, the judge cleared his throat softly. Hazel looked up. "May I ask," the judge said gently, "what you said to him?" Hazel looked around as if surprised the grown-ups were still there. Then she glanced at her mother, who nodded softly. Hazel stood gently nudging Max's head from her lap, though he seemed reluctant to move, and then turned toward the bench. "I told him," she said clearly, "that he's my hero." "Good boy." The words, so simple and light in her small voice, dropped into the room like the most sacred truth. A few people cried. Others smiled through tears. Even the court reporter, usually robotic in her task, wiped her cheek once before continuing. The judge leaned back in his chair, his hands folded over his notes. His voice, when it returned, was quiet and kind. "This court will recess for an additional 10 minutes. We need a moment." As the gavel tapped gently, people exhaled all at once. Hazel turned and walked back toward her mother. Max followed behind, rising smoothly to his feet and trailing her like a shadow woven from loyalty. His tail wagged just once, slow and sweeping. As they reached the back of the courtroom, Hazel looked up at Evan. "You take care of him?" she asked. Evan crouched low, his voice gravel-soft. "I promise I will." Hazel reached out her hand. Evan took it, squeezing gently. "Thank you," he whispered. Nora pulled Hazel into her arms, holding her tightly now, her chest rising and falling with breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "You did something amazing, sweetheart," she murmured. "I just told the truth." Hazel said, her voice barely louder than the whisper that had changed everything. Outside the courtroom, news of what had happened inside moved like fire across dry grass. Cameras remained barred from entering, but that didn't stop anchors from recounting the moment again and again. The little girl who whispered to the dog and changed the course of a trial. Social media erupted with support hashtags blossoming like flowers. Across screens, digital portraits of Hazel and Max already being shared within hours. But inside that courtroom, in the quiet that followed, something had changed, not just in public opinion, not just in the courtroom dynamic, but in the very tone of the case itself. No longer was Max seen through the lens of accusation. Now he was being seen through the eyes of a child. And eyes like that don't forget what they've truly seen. As Nora led Hazel out through the wide wooden doors, a reporter called her name, but she didn't answer. She only looked down at her daughter, who still clutched beans and who still looked back at the double doors like she had just left something sacred behind. And maybe she had. Back inside, Evan returned to his seat beside Max. He stroked the dog's back once slowly, his fingers brushing the thick fur near his collar. "You never stopped being a hero," he whispered. Max leaned into the touch and closed his eyes. And behind them, the courtroom remained still, caught in the weight of a whisper that had said everything that needed saying. The sky over Willow Creek that night was ink dark and silent, as if even the stars were waiting. In the small living room of a white clapboard house just a few streets from the courthouse, Nora Fields sat alone on the sofa, her legs curled beneath her, and a half-drunk cup of tea going cold beside her. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft breath of her daughter sleeping upstairs. The kind of quiet that carried the weight of memory more than peace. Her laptop screen glowed in front of her cursor, blinking on an empty Facebook post box. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, unmoving. She had typed and deleted the same message 5 times already, uncertain what words could possibly fit the swirl of thoughts in her head. She took a breath and tried again. Were you at Lakeside Park on the 14th of last month, around 4 p.m.? Did you see a large German shepherd? Or anything unusual involving a man and a child? Please reach out. It's important. She stared at it, read it twice, and clicked post. The message appeared in the Willow Creek Neighborhood Watch group within seconds, just words. No photos, no hashtags. She didn't expect anything, not really. But she had to try. Because for the first time since the park incident, everything that had been blurry and unspoken began rising with startling clarity. She remembered the day now with frightening sharpness. It had been late afternoon, the light slanting warm and gold through the trees, Hazel toddling a few paces ahead on the gravel path, giggling and dragging her toy dog Beans by one ear. Nora had paused to tie her shoelace. It took no more than 10 seconds. 10 seconds of looking down. And when she looked up, she saw him. The man. He had appeared from the bend in the path, stumbling slightly. His shirt stained, one hand gripping a flask, the other waving wildly as he muttered to himself. He was shouting something incoherent, his voice sharp and laced with the slur of someone well past sober. His eyes had locked onto Hazel like a misplaced thought, and his feet had started moving faster than his mind could catch. Nora remembered the scream building in her throat, the way her hands fumbled as she sprang to her feet. She had cried out Hazel's name once, loud and terrified, and started to run. But someone else got there first. From somewhere out of sight, a blur shot between the trees, powerful and fast, a dog large and focused, its coat streaked with black and gold, its body moving like muscle given purpose. Max. She didn't know his name then. He had no badge, no leash, just instinct. He positioned himself directly between Hazel and the approaching man, growling once low, deep, and unmistakably clear. The man froze, faltered, then turned and stumbled away, hurling curses as he vanished down the path. The dog gave a single bark, took a few bounding steps, as if to ensure he was leaving, and then returned. He sat beside Hazel, tall and still, until Nora reached them, heart pounding in her ears, his breath ragged from fear. And then he was gone. Before she could thank him, before she could ask where he had come from, or if he belonged to anyone. The moment had passed. She had been too shaken to chase after him, too overwhelmed to file a report. She had cradled Hazel in her arms and walked away, whispering that everything was okay, even if it didn't feel like it yet. Back then she had told herself it must have been a stray dog, one of those miraculous coincidences the universe throws in once in a while. But in her heart, something had never sat right with that version of the story. And now seeing Max in the courtroom, seeing the way Hazel had recognized him, trusted him, whispered to him like he was a piece of her memory brought back to life, it confirmed everything she hadn't let herself believe. He hadn't been astray. He had been watching, working, protecting, and now he needed protecting in return. The cursor blinked again. A quiet chime broke her focus, a notification. Someone had replied to her post. She opened the message. Karen Miller here. I live on Sycamore Drive right near the park entrance. My doorbell camera faces the sidewalk. I think I may have caught something that day. I'll check my footage. Nora's breath caught. She replied immediately, fingers flying. That would mean everything. Thank you. Another notification, another comment, then another. By morning, her inbox was full, dozens of people chiming in. Some offered support. Others recalled seeing a dog matching Max's description in the area on that same day. A few remembered hearing a commotion, though none had seen it directly. And then came the message that made Nora sit upright and place both hands flat on the kitchen table to steady herself. "I think I have what you're looking for." My doorbell cam caught a man acting strange near a little girl. "There's a dog." He steps in. I thought it was nothing, just a weird moment. But now I'm not so sure. I'll send the video. The sender was Sandra Moore, a retired school teacher who lived across from the park's eastern trailhead. Her camera covered a slice of the path where it briefly passed behind her fence. The angle wasn't perfect. The resolution was grainy. But what it showed was clear. A man, staggering, approaching fast. A child, small, alone. And then from the edge of the frame, a blur of motion, a German shepherd charging and placing itself between them, barking just once low and precise. The man flinched, turned, and ran. The dog waited, watched, then walked away. Nora stared at the screen as the footage looped. It was real. Her hand trembled as she clicked download and then forwarded the file first to the defense attorney's email, then to Evans. She followed with a text message and left a voicemail just in case. She didn't sleep the rest of that night. When the morning light spilled across the kitchen floor and Hazel's sleepy voice called from upstairs, Nora went up and held her for longer than usual. "You okay, Mommy?" Hazel asked, rubbing her eyes. "I am now," Nora whispered. By mid-morning, Evan had replied, "I can't thank you enough. This changes everything." And it did. The defense team submitted the footage within hours, filing a motion to include it as new evidence. The judge approved an emergency hearing. Reporters lined the courthouse steps again, their cameras clicking like cicadas in summer heat. News segments opened with the words, "A mother's memory and a child's truth may just rewrite the story of Willow Creek's most emotional trial." But Nora wasn't thinking about the headlines. She was thinking about the moment a stranger had once stood between her daughter and danger, with no one watching and no thanks expected. She was thinking about the silence she had let pass after it happened, and how now finally the silence was breaking. Because sometimes the truth doesn't shout. Sometimes it walks on four legs, waits quietly in the corner, and simply needs someone to say, "I remember." And as she dressed Hazel in a clean dress and packed beans into her daughter's small backpack for the day ahead, Nora felt something lift in her chest, something long buried now rising. They were going back to court. But this time, they weren't sitting in silence. This time, they were bringing the missing piece with them. The courtroom was still in that tense and almost reverent way a room becomes, when truth is no longer a concept, but a presence. No one whispered. No one shuffled. The clicking of pens and tapping of keyboards had stopped. Even the reporters in the back corner, who normally lived for quiet murmurs to spin into headlines, sat in stunned, almost cautious silence. They had come expecting another wave of testimony, more speculation, perhaps even emotion. But they hadn't expected this. A television cart had been wheeled in, old-fashioned in design, but unmistakably modern in consequence. The screen flickered once, a blue standby signal glowing gently against the polished wood of the witness box. The judge sat taller in his seat. Evan, seated beside Max once more, leaned forward with his hands clasped so tightly they had begun to pale at the knuckles. At the defense table, Nora sat beside Hazel, who was perched on a booster cushion. Hazel hugged her worn plush toy beans tightly to her chest. She wasn't nervous. Not like the adults. She looked at the screen like it was a bedtime story coming to life. Because for her, it wasn't about legal arguments. It was about something simple and sacred remembering. The defense attorney stood slowly holding a small remote in one hand. His voice was composed, quiet, almost somber. He didn't need to be dramatic. The moment would speak for itself. "Your Honor," he began, "we submit for consideration a video captured by the doorbell camera of Mrs. Sandra Moore, a resident whose property faces the trail leading into Lakeside Park. The footage is from the date in question. No edits, no enhancements. Just a real-time recording of the event that brought us here today." The judge gave a single nod. "Proceed." The attorney pressed play. The footage began with a faint shake, the telltale timestamp blinking in the corner. The image was grainy, the color washed out in the late afternoon sun. But the story it told was unmistakable. First came the trail of peaceful scene trees lining the sides, light wind brushing fallen leaves across the path. Then from the left side of the frame, a small figure emerged. Hazel. Her pink dress fluttered as she toddled forward, dragging beans in one hand, the innocence of the moment framed by stillness and sunlight. Then from the opposite direction, another figure. A man, tall, unsteady, stumbling. His jacket hung crooked off one shoulder, a shiny object flashing briefly in his hand, perhaps a flask or something more dangerous. His steps were uneven but purposeful. He saw the child and began to move faster. In the courtroom, the tension became almost unbearable. And then came the moment. From the very edge of the frame, a blur shot into view, a German shepherd focused and full of controlled power, moving with the precision of muscle and mission. Max. He planted himself directly in front of Hazel, his body rigid, his tail down, ears forward. The man froze. Max barked once, a single warning. But the man didn't stop. He reached forward, shouting something indiscernible, his hand extended. And that's when Max struck. A leap forward, a sharp turn of the head, jaws closing around the man's arm, not savagely, not wildly, but with targeted restraint. The man stumbled back, screaming, falling out of frame. Max released instantly, standing his ground, but not chasing. Hazel stood behind him, untouched. Then just as quickly, the clip ended. The screen went black. No one moved. No one needed to. The judge exhaled long and slow. "Play it again," he said softly. They did. The second time, people watched, not for the surprise of it, but for the detail, the posture of Max's body, the clear moment of restraint, the way he waited until the last possible second to respond with force, and then did so with absolute control. It wasn't aggression. It was protection. It was training. It was instinct. It was the truth. When the clip ended a second time, the defense attorney turned to the jury. "No further narration is needed. The footage speaks for itself." The prosecution stood flustered, but determined. "Your Honor, while this footage is indeed compelling, it only shows a narrow slice of the interaction. We cannot see the events immediately preceding or following." The judge held up a hand. "We've seen enough." He looked slowly across the room, his gaze moving from the jury to the gallery, from Clint Redford, who now sat pale and tight-lipped, to Nora and Hazel, and finally to Max. That dog, the judge said, did not act in aggression. He acted with discipline and purpose. No gavel, no ruling, just those words hanging heavy in the room like church bells. Max, seated beside Evan, seemed unfazed, but his ears turned slightly as if even he had caught the shift in tone. The tide had turned. Outside the courthouse, word spread like wildfire. Within minutes, local news anchors had interrupted their regular programming. Clips of the footage, though still officially sealed from the public, were described in vivid detail. Twitter lit up. Hashtags surged back into trending. One post simply read, "Hero, not suspect." Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was no longer tense. It was reverent. Every side conversation faded. Every eye turned to Max, not with suspicion, but with awe. Then something unexpected happened. During the short recess that followed, a man approached the defense team, older, suntanned, with calloused hands and a faded uniform jacket that read, "Willow Park's Maintenance." His name was Dennis Briggs, and he introduced himself in a hushed voice. "I saw it," he said. Evan turned. "The attack, the whole thing?" Dennis nodded. "I was fixing a broken water line near the playground. I heard the commotion, looked up. Saw that dog jump in like a rocket. That kid would have been hurt if he hadn't. Why didn't you say anything before?" the attorney asked gently. "I didn't think it was that serious," Dennis said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Thought it was just a drunk scaring a kid and a dog doing what dogs do. But now, after seeing that girl in the video, I knew I should say something." He was sworn in within the hour. And when Dennis spoke to the court, clear, calm, and full of working man honesty, his words rang truer than any legal document. "That dog didn't lunge until the man reached for the girl," he said. "And when he did, he didn't go for the throat. Just the arm. Just enough to stop him. Then he let go. That's not a wild dog. That's a good one." A murmur of agreement spread through the gallery. Even some of the jurors nodded subtly. Clint Redford sat like a statue, his face losing color with every passing second. As Dennis stepped down, the judge closed his notebook. "I believe the court has heard what it needed." The defense rested. No theatrics, no drama, just the quiet understanding that what had once been uncertain was now undeniable. Max had not attacked out of rage. He had acted in the exact way he was trained to protect. And as the court recessed for the day and people began rising from their seats, Nora reached down to button Hazel's jacket. The little girl looked up and said, "Is he safe now, Mommy?" Nora kissed the top of her head. "He's safer than ever." Outside, the air had shifted. It no longer pressed down on their shoulders like a storm. It lifted warm and light and filled with the kind of calm that only truth can bring. Max walked beside Evan as they stepped out into the sun, the leash loose in Evan's hand, but unnecessary. Because trust, real trust, doesn't need to be tethered. And somewhere in the back of the courtroom, a story had changed. Not because of a headline, not because of a verdict, but because someone had watched. Someone had remembered, and someone had cared enough to share what they had seen. It was the kind of silence that hummed, the kind that wasn't really quiet at all, but pulsed beneath the surface of every glance, every breath, every heartbeat in the room. After the footage had been shown, after Max's steady stance and Hazel's clear recognition of him, the courtroom had changed. The mood wasn't defensive anymore. It wasn't divided. It had become something heavier, something close to reverence. But the story wasn't done telling itself. The judge had returned from recess with a new stillness in his face, the kind of look that suggested the facts were beginning to align, piece by piece, into something undeniable. The jurors, too, sat straighter now, their notes neater, their eyes sharper, as if they, too, had begun to sense a shift they hadn't been prepared for. It was no longer a matter of doubt. It was a matter of confirmation. That's when the bailiff stepped forward again, a folded piece of paper in hand, which he placed gently on the judge's bench. The judge opened it, read silently for a moment, then glanced toward the defense table. "I've just been informed," he said, voice calm and measured, "that a new witness has requested to speak. His name is Leo Danner. He works for the Willow Creek Parks Department." A low murmur spread through the courtroom. Nora turned toward Evan, her brows raised. Even the reporters in the back began adjusting their lenses again. The judge looked over the top of his glasses. "Does the defense know this man?" Evan stood. "I do, Your Honor. He's a groundskeeper. He knows that trail better than anyone." "Is he here?" the judge asked. The doors opened before anyone could answer. Leo Danner stepped inside. He wasn't the kind of man who normally drew attention. In fact, he looked like someone you'd pass a dozen times in a week and never think twice about tall, wiry, in a faded brown work jacket with a name patch sewn above the heart. His boots were scuffed and his cap bore the symbol of the Parks Department sweat-ringed from years of service. But there was something quiet and solid in his walk, the sort of honesty that can't be faked. He moved to the stand, placed his hand on the Bible, and took the oath with a simple, "Yes, sir." The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Danner, you've come forward voluntarily." "I have." "What do you want the court to know?" Leo glanced once toward Max, then to Hazel, and finally to the jury. "I saw the whole thing," he said. "Didn't plan to get involved at first. I figured someone else had spoken up already. But when I saw the news this morning, saw that little girl, I knew I should have come forward sooner." Evan's attorney stepped closer. "Tell us what happened." Leo cleared his throat, his voice low but steady. "I was working that day, fixing a broken water line near the edge of the playground. It was quiet. I had my back turned at first, but then I heard a scream, a child's voice. I looked up and saw a man, big guy, storming toward the little girl. She was near the trees, looked frozen in place. I started to move, but then I saw something else." He nodded toward Max. "That dog. He came in fast, no hesitation. Planted himself between the girl and the man, like it was second nature." "Did you see the man make any aggressive moves?" the lawyer asked. "Yes, sir." He lunged, arm outstretched. I couldn't hear what he said, but it didn't look friendly. And Max Leo nodded firmly. He waited. Gave a bark. Didn't jump first. But when the man reached for the kid, that's when he acted. Bit his arm just enough to stop him, then backed off. "Was it excessive?" the lawyer asked. "Did Max appear out of control?" "Not at all. He did what he was trained to do. He didn't maul him. He just protected her. That's a good dog." Whispers swept through the rows behind them, soft and urgent. The lawyer nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Danner." The judge turned to the prosecution. "Would you like to cross-examine Clint Redford's attorney?" Stood eyes tight. "No questions, Your Honor." Leo stepped down, nodding politely as he returned to his seat in the gallery. Evan sat back a breath, leaving his chest like a weight pulled off his ribs. He reached down to Max, who sat beside him, with a kind of composure that could only come from years of discipline. Evan ran his hand once down Max's spine, feeling the familiar ridge of muscle and the thrum of quiet power beneath fur. "You did good, buddy," he whispered. At the defense table, Nora turned to Hazel. "You heard that?" she asked. Hazel nodded, her voice hushed. "He remembers too." The judge straightened in his chair. "Unless there are further witnesses, I believe we're nearing the end of testimony." But then something happened. Hazel stood up. No one called on her. No one expected her. But she rose to her feet, placed beans on her chair, and stepped away from her mother's side. Hazel, Nora whispered, reaching instinctively. But Hazel walked forward toward Max. The courtroom froze again. She paused at the center where the light from the high windows fell in a beam across the polished wood floor. Max turned his head, ears forward, eyes steady. Evan looked to the judge, uncertain. The judge didn't stop it. He watched. Everyone did. Hazel reached Max and crouched beside him. And then, with all the clarity of a memory, finally coming full circle, she placed both hands on either side of Max's face and said loudly, clearly enough for everyone to hear, "I remember now." She turned to the courtroom. "He barked at the bad man. He stood in front of me. He saved me." Her voice wavered, but never broke. Then she wrapped her arms around Max's neck and held him tightly, her curls brushing his fur. her body folded around the dog who had once stood like a wall between her and something awful. Max didn't move. He let her. And when she pulled back just a little, she added one more thing. "You're my hero." And with that, the courtroom cracked wide open. Some people cried. Others smiled. But no one doubted. The story wasn't incomplete anymore. It had just been waiting for the right voice to finish it. The verdict didn't thunder. It didn't arrive with fireworks or a gavel cracked sharply against the bench. It didn't rise above the murmurs of the courtroom in some dramatic crescendo of victory. Instead, it came quietly, gently, as if truth, when finally recognized, needed no applause. The judge adjusted his glasses, a slight tremble in his hand, as he flipped through the last pages of his notes. The gallery sat frozen. The air taut as a pulled string, everyone leaning forward just enough to betray how deeply they cared about what came next. Hazel clung to her mother's arm, her small body curled sideways in her seat, Max's head still resting beside her feet. Nora stroked her daughter's back slowly, her heart pounding in rhythms she couldn't slow. Evan sat to their left, silent, his hand lightly placed across Max's shoulder as though grounding them both in this final moment. This court, the judge began, his voice low but deliberate, has reviewed all presented evidence, including the video footage, witness testimony, and the character of the K-9 involved. He paused, then looked directly at Max, something almost human softening his eyes. This court finds that Max did not act with unwarranted aggression. Rather, he responded to an immediate and credible threat against a child, utilizing precise, restrained force in line with his professional training. A long exhale filled the room, one breath shared by dozens of lungs. The request for euthanasia is hereby denied. Whispers broke loose. Not from chaos, but from disbelief turning into joy. This court recognizes Max's years of service, his exceptional composure during trial, and the impact his presence has had on this community, both in uniform and beyond. Another pause. Max is cleared of all charges. He is free to live the remainder of his life in peace and with honor. No gavel fell. The room didn't need it. Instead, what followed was applause, not loud or raucous, but full and warm, like a standing ovation offered with reverence rather than celebration. Some stood, others cried. A few placed their hands over their hearts. And at the center of it all, Max simply looked up, blinked once, and thumped his tail against the wood floor. Calm, composed, as if he'd known all along. Hazel jumped from her chair and wrapped her arms around his neck again. "You did it," she whispered, burying her face in his fur. "You get to stay." Evan rose slowly, his hand still resting on Max's shoulder, and turned to Nora. She stood too, a bit shakily, as the courtroom slowly emptied around them. Her hands fluttered to fix Hazel's curls, but her eyes remained fixed on the dog who had saved her child and who had just been saved in return. Evan cleared his throat, voice still raw from everything the trial had taken out of him. "You're the reason he's still here." Nora looked at him, brows furrowed. Evan glanced down at Max, who was now sitting comfortably between them, tail sweeping across the floor like a broom of quiet gratitude. "I mean it," Evan continued. "You didn't have to speak. You didn't have to come forward. But you did. And it changed everything." Nora's voice was soft. "I was just doing what felt right." "Yeah," Evan said, lips lifting into the first real smile she'd seen from him. "That's the thing, doing the right thing when no one's asking you to. That's rare." A long silence passed, the kind filled not with awkwardness, but with understanding. Then Evan looked back at Max, reaching down to rub behind his ears, the gesture slow and full of affection. "I've been thinking," he said, almost like he was speaking to Max more than Nora. "He's getting older." I'm still working nights, still on call half the week. He deserves better. Nora's head tilted slightly. Better? A home, Evan said. A real one. With a family, a yard, toys that squeak. Someone who reads bedtime stories out loud without realizing he's listening. Nora blinked, caught off guard. Are you saying I'm saying? Evan nodded slowly that if you're willing, I'd like you and Hazel to have him. Hazel gasped before Nora could even answer. Really, she squealed. Really, really? Evan chuckled, crouching down to Hazel's height. Really? But only if your mom says yes. Hazel turned to Nora, eyes wide and sparkling. Please, Mommy, she whispered. Please, please, please. Nora stared down at Max, her heart caught somewhere between awe and panic. She wasn't prepared for this. She hadn't imagined it. But as she looked at the dog sitting so calmly by her daughter's side, the dog who had stepped between Hazel and danger, who had never once asked for praise, who had simply done what was right, she felt something soft break open inside her. Max turned to look at her just for a moment, and she saw the intelligence in his eyes, the patience, the quiet strength. It wasn't just about protecting. It was about belonging. She hesitated, blinking back sudden tears. I don't know the first thing about retired police dogs. Evan smiled gently. You know the first thing about love. That's enough. Hazel grabbed Nora's hand, bouncing slightly on her toes. He can sleep in my room. I'll read him stories every night. I'll brush his fur. I'll even let him eat my toast if he wants. Max huffed as if in agreement. And then somewhere between all the reasons Nora had not to say yes, she heard the quietest one whisper through her heart. He already belongs to us. She nodded. Okay, she said, her voice breaking on the word. Okay, yes. Hazel screamed with delight and threw her arms around Max once more. You're coming home. Evan stood again, brushing at something invisible in his eye. I'll bring over his things, he said, his voice unsteady but full. His bed, his toys. He likes peanut butter, by the way, and he hates the sound of thunder. He'll try to hide in the closet, but he's too big, so just let him lie near your bed. Nora laughed through her tears. Thank you, Evan, for everything. No, Evan said. Thank you. You gave him his life back. They left the courthouse as the sun began to dip behind the brick buildings of downtown Willow Creek. The air was warm, touched with the scent of magnolias blooming along the sidewalk. Reporters tried to catch up with them, cameras rolling, questions flying, but Nora kept walking, Hazel holding one hand, Max walking proudly on her other side. Someone snapped a photo, Hazel with her arm wrapped around Max's neck. Nora laughing softly beside them, sunlight flaring off Max's fur like a halo. By evening, that image would spread across every news outlet in the county. But for now, it was just theirs. That night, Nora opened the door to her home and stepped aside as Max entered no longer as a guest, but as family. He sniffed every corner of the living room, circled Hazel's room twice, then lay down on the rug beside her bed, as if he had always known that was where he belonged. Hazel lay beside him with beans tucked under one arm and whispered, You're home now. You don't have to be a hero tonight. Just my best friend. Max blinked once, then closed his eyes. In the hallway, Nora stood watching them, one hand on the doorframe, the other pressed gently to her chest. And for the first time in a long time, her home felt not just safe, but whole. Outside, the sky deepened to lavender. Inside, Hazel drifted off to sleep with one hand resting on Max's back. His breathing slow and even, his body warm against hers, like a promise kept. They had rescued him. But in the quiet of that room, in the stillness between the ticking of the clock and the hum of the air, it was clear. He had rescued them too. The mornings at the Fields' house had changed. Gone were the slow silences, the soundless toasts popped into the kitchen, and the careful footsteps taken so Hazel wouldn't wake too early. Now each day began with the rustle of paws across hardwood, the soft thud of a tail wagging against furniture, and the unmistakable melody of a little girl's laughter echoing through the hallways like birdsong in spring. Max had settled in as if he had always belonged. He had claimed the rug by the window as his favorite resting spot where he could lie stretched out and warm in the sunbeam that moved across the living room like a gentle tide. His bed, an oversized pillow-stuffed mat that Evan had delivered in the back of his truck, sat beside Hazel's. Though more often than not, Max ended up curled beneath her window. Instead, his body like a sentry stationed between dream and daylight. Hazel had embraced her new role with the solemnity of a child given a secret mission. She brushed Max's coat each morning, her small hands methodical and tender, singing to him softly as she worked. She read to him in the afternoons, picture books about knights and dragons, often stopping to point at the illustrations and explain, "That's you, Max. You're the brave one. The dragon doesn't stand a chance." Max listened. He always listened. Sometimes he tilted his head as if deeply contemplating the plot. Other times, he simply lay there, tail thumping gently at the most exciting parts, or eyes, blinking slow with the kind of contentment that cannot be manufactured, it has to be earned. In the backyard, they invented games that made no sense to anyone but them. Hazel would run with her arms out like airplane wings, Max bounding beside her with careful, measured joy, never outrunning her, always watching. She built obstacle courses out of hula hoops and plastic buckets, and Max, gracious as a champion, would trot through them with patient dignity, even when Hazel made him wear a pink feather boa or a crown of paper flowers. "You're a prince now," she'd declare. "No more patrol, just tea parties." And Max, ever obliging, would sit still at her side, watching the world unfold with the quiet eyes of a dog who had seen too much to be surprised but still found wonder in every day. Nora watched from the porch, coffee in hand, heart full in a way she hadn't known was possible. It was like breathing had become easier, like her home was no longer just walls and windows, but something alive, something held together not just by beams, but by belonging. Max had softened something in all of them. Even Evan, who came by often with treats and chew toys and stories from his time on the force, seemed lighter when he stepped through the door. He no longer carried the weight of being Max's handler. Now he came as a friend, sometimes staying for dinner, sometimes joining them in the backyard as Hazel acted out plays with Max in the leading role. One afternoon, as they all sat under the shade of the old oak tree that stretched wide across the lawn, Evan tossed a stick into the grass and watched Max retrieve it with calm precision. "He still moves like a soldier," Evan said, smiling. Hazel clapped. "He's the best at fetch," Nora nodded. "He's so gentle with her, like he knows she's the reason he's here." Evan was quiet for a moment, then looked toward Nora. "You ever think about what's next for him?" She tilted her head. "You mean beyond tea parties and fairy crowns?" He chuckled. "I mean, retirement's treating him well, obviously. But he still has that presence." "You know I know," she said, watching Max as he returned the stick and sat neatly by Hazel's side. "I was talking to someone," Evan continued, "a friend of mine who works with therapy animals. She saw the trial, saw what happened with Hazel in court. She called me the next day and said she'd never seen anything like it." Nora looked at him. She asked if we'd ever considered getting Max certified as a therapy dog. The words settled between them, not as a suggestion, but as a possibility. "A therapy dog," Nora echoed. "Yeah," Evan said. "Hospitals, schools, support groups, places where people need calm, presence. Dogs like Max, with his history, his training, and his temperament, they can do incredible work." Nora glanced toward the yard where Hazel was now sitting cross-legged in the grass. Max stretched out beside her, his head resting in her lap. "He's already doing that here," she murmured. "Exactly," Evan said. "Imagine what he could do for others." Nora watched them, her heart swelling. "I'd never thought about it. I didn't think... after all he's been through, I figured he deserved to rest." Evan nodded slowly. "He does. But some dogs, some people too, they heal by helping." They fell into a comfortable silence, broken only by Hazel's voice as she narrated a new adventure where Max was both pirate and sea captain, Beans his loyal crew. That night, as Nora tucked Hazel into bed, Max curled at the foot of her mattress as usual. Hazel pulled the covers to her chin and asked Mommy, "Do you think Max likes bedtime stories?" "I think he loves them," Nora said, brushing a curl from Hazel's forehead. "Do you think he's happy?" Nora looked at Max, eyes closed, breath slow, peaceful in the warm hush of the room. "I think he's more than happy," she whispered. "I think he's home." But the next morning, as the sunlight spilled through the kitchen window and Hazel poured kibble into Max's bowl with a song on her lips, Nora's thoughts returned to Evan's words. What if Max could be more than just safe? What if he could bring that same safety to others? She opened her laptop and began to type. The following week, Nora and Evan brought Max to a local facility run by Healing Steps, an organization specializing in training retired service animals to work as therapy companions. The building sat at the edge of town, bright with murals and flower beds, its staff warm and wide-eyed. The moment Max stepped through the door, the trainer, a woman named Lonnie with gray hair in a long braid and hands that smelled like biscuits, knelt down in front of Max and looked into his eyes. "You've seen things," she said gently, "and you're still standing. That's what makes a healer." Max blinked once. "Let's see what you've got, sweetheart." The training was different from the rigid drills of police K-9 units. There were no bark commands, no takedown routines, no scent trails to follow. Instead, it was about presence remaining calm, in rooms filled with wheelchairs and IV stands offering stillness beside trembling hands, walking slowly beside those who'd forgotten how to feel safe. Hazel insisted on coming to every session. She'd sit quietly off to the side, watching Max perform his tasks, greeting with gentle nudges, lying still beside anxious patients, offering his silent company, like a soft answer to unspoken pain. She helped too. Sometimes she'd pretend to be a patient lying on a cot as Max approached. She'd smile when he rested his head beside her, then whisper, "You're doing amazing." And he was. Within a month, Max was officially certified. They gave him a vest navy blue with a silver patch that read, "Therapy Dog Max," and a badge in the shape of a paw print. He wore it proudly, ears alert, chest lifted as if understanding this was a new chapter, a new kind of mission. His first visit was to a pediatric cancer ward. Children sat with masks and IV poles, their faces weary but curious. Max entered the room, and everything stilled. One little boy, no older than 6, reached out with a trembling hand. Max moved closer, laid his head in the boy's lap, and stayed. That evening, back at home, Hazel climbed into bed and pulled Max close. "You're a hero again," she whispered, but a quiet kind. Max blinked at her, his eyes full of that familiar depth of someone who had once guarded with force and now healed with presence. In the hallway, Nora stood watching them. The bedroom bathed in the golden light of a fading day. From warrior to companion, from protector to peace. Max hadn't lost his purpose in retirement. He had simply found a gentler way to fulfill it. The training ground at Healing Steps wasn't built like a course. It was built like a world that needed softness. There were no fences or hurdles, no orders barked through megaphones, no protective sleeves or dummies for takedowns. Instead, the room had wheelchairs parked beside soft couches, IV stands, standing like tall willows along the corner's hospital beds, set up with teddy bears tucked in their folds and chairs circled like a quiet support group, waiting for someone to sit and speak their pain. For Max, it was a different kind of battlefield. Not one fought with brawn, but with patience, calm, and the silent assurance of being present. He walked through it slowly, his paws padding softly on the floor that gleamed like a quiet lake in winter. His head was lower now, not in submission but in attunement, as if he had begun to read emotions in the air like scent trails. He no longer scanned for threats. Instead, he listened for the tremors in hearts. Each day, Evan brought Max to the facility, but Hazel always asked to come too. She insisted it was important, and Nora had long stopped questioning it. The girl brought along her backpack filled with picture books, plastic stethoscopes, and one well-worn plush bunny that always served as emotional support staff. Hazel didn't just tag along, she became part of Max's retraining. "Today we're going to pretend I'm scared of thunder," she'd announce, climbing into a mock-up hospital bed. She'd pull the covers over her head, breathing loudly and shivering on purpose. Max would stand a few feet away, unsure at first. "Okay, now come help me, Max," she'd say softly. Evan, standing nearby with the trainers, always watched closely, not just Max's movement, but the way Hazel's voice affected him. And each time, Max would take one quiet step forward, then another, until he reached the bed, nudged the blanket back gently with his snout, and placed his head beside Hazel's arm. She'd smile. "Perfect," she'd say. "See, I feel better already." The trainers at Healing Steps were impressed not just by Max's behavior, but by something they called his emotional literacy, a way of sensing pain without reacting impulsively, of offering calm even when surrounded by tension. One trainer, Lonnie, often remarked, "Some dogs need training to ignore chaos. Max, he waits for calm to be needed." His days were now filled with learning how to sit beside grieving parents, how to lie still when someone cried into his fur, how to stay when a wheelchair rolled over too close, or a child with trembling hands reached out to hug him tightly. It was no longer about commands and obedience. It was about presence. Hazel invented her own training games. In one, she wore her eye patch and pretended to be a pirate who had lost her ship and her crew. Max was the only one left, and he had to help her find hope again. "You don't have to fight anymore," she whispered one afternoon after a particularly emotional game. "You just have to be." Then came the final evaluation day. Max had passed every test: emotional stability, public behavior, reaction to sudden sounds, and erratic movements. But this one was different. This one would decide whether he was ready to be deployed as a certified therapy dog in real-world scenarios. The test was held in a simulated courtroom, echoing in size and solemnity like the one where Max had once stood trial. Ironically, it was the same room now used to determine if he could return not as the accused, but as a quiet comfort. Max was to enter while children sat pretending to be anxious or sad. His task wasn't to perform tricks or obey commands. It was simply to be there, to move gently, to sense who needed him most, and to offer stillness without prompting. He stood at the doorway, ears alert. Hazel gave him a nod from the corner. Max stepped inside. He scanned the room, not sharply, not as a soldier scanning for danger, but like someone reading a familiar book. He moved to the far bench where a boy sat curled up, arms wrapped tight around himself. Max approached slowly. The boy flinched. Max sat down, not close, just near enough for his presence to be felt. Then, without command, Max stretched out on the floor and laid his head near the boy's feet. The boy stared. After a moment, his hand reached out. Max didn't move. The hand found fur, a soft stroke, then another. Max stayed still, breathing quiet and even, tail twitching only slightly as if to say, "I'm here." Hazel beamed from the corner. "He's doing it," she whispered to Nora. He was. And when the trainers gathered afterward to review his performance, the room was unanimous. Max had passed. 2 weeks later, Max returned to the courthouse. But this time he wore a navy blue vest with a patch stitched lovingly by Hazel Max, therapy dog. Beneath that, in her scrawled handwriting, brave and kind. The marble floors of the building felt familiar under his paws. But the tension that had once hung like fog had lifted. Now, as they walked past the security check and down the echoing halls, people paused and smiled. Even the guards nodded. They weren't surprised. They had all seen the trial. They had all seen Hazel walk up and say, "He saved me." Now they saw something else. Redemption wearing fur and a badge. The courtroom wasn't in session that day. It had been reserved for a special program designed for children caught in difficult legal circumstances. Those testifying in abuse cases, children in custody battles, kids pulled into a system too large for their hearts to understand. The organizers had invited Max as part of a pilot comfort initiative. When Hazel arrived with Max, the room had already filled with whispers. "Is that him? The dog from the trial? He's the one they talked about in the news." Hazel held Max's leash proudly, walking beside Nora and Evan like she was leading royalty. In one corner of the room, a little girl sat alone, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. Hazel looked at Max. He looked back, and just like they'd practiced, she gave him a small nod. Max walked slowly to the girl, pausing a few feet away. She glanced up, then away. Max didn't move. He lay down gently, his tail resting beside his legs. After a moment, the girl scooted forward, then again, and finally she reached out and touched the top of his head. Hazel watched with quiet pride. "That's it," she whispered. "That's how he helps." The room softened. Even the adults, the lawyers and social workers seemed to breathe easier. Max sat with each child, never too close, never intrusive. Sometimes all he did was breathe near them, reminding them they were not alone. Other times he accepted quiet hugs, soft whispers, or the weight of trembling hands needing something constant. He had been trained for combat. Now he was trained for care. That night, as they returned home, Hazel sat beside Max in the back seat. "You were amazing today," she whispered, leaning against him. Max blinked slowly, his body still and warm. "You used to scare people," she said softly, "but now you help them feel brave." Max looked out the window. The streetlights passed by like quiet sentinels glowing in soft amber. "You changed," Hazel added. "But it wasn't like magic. It was like remembering who you've always been." At home, Nora stood at the doorway as they stepped inside. She watched as Hazel removed Max's vest, folded it carefully, and placed it on the hook beside her school backpack. Max curled up on the rug, Hazel beside him, reading from a book. No commands, no orders, just presence. The quiet power of a dog who had walked through accusation, through judgment, through fear, and emerged not hardened, but gentler. Not broken, but repurposed. The next morning, there was already a new message in Nora's inbox, another courthouse across the state requesting a visit from Max. And as she sipped her coffee, watching Hazel and Max play tug-of-war with a toy shaped like a smiling sun, Nora couldn't help but wonder what new hearts he would help mend next. He had come full circle from the defendant to the healer. And this time he was walking into courtrooms not with a leash of control, but with one of hope. There are kinds of silence that soothe, and then there are silences that listen. Nora had grown used to the first kind since Max entered their lives. The calm nights filled with Hazel's soft breathing, the quiet hum of Max's presence by the door, the rustle of bedtime stories drifting into sleep. It was the kind of silence that wrapped around a home like a warm quilt. But lately, another kind of silence had crept in, a heavier one lurking in the edges of routine. It began with the envelope. No return address, just her name, Nora Fields, printed in all caps. She had opened it in the kitchen, Hazel upstairs, humming to herself, Max resting near the radiator. The paper inside was creased and stained with what looked like oil. No greeting, no signature, just words scrawled in red ink. Monsters deserve cages, and so do the ones who shelter them. Her hands trembled. She read it again, then again. Max rose from the floor, sensing her tension, padding over to rest his head near her knee. "Is someone mad at me?" Hazel asked innocently that night when Nora's voice shook, reading her a story. "No, sweetie," Nora said, brushing her hair back. "No one's mad at you." But she didn't sleep well. The next morning she showed the letter to Evan. He didn't say much at first, just read it slowly twice, then again under the light from the cafe window where they'd agreed to meet. When he finally looked up, his jaw had tensed into a familiar line. "I know who sent this," he said. "Clint Redford," Nora whispered. Evan nodded. "I've had a bad feeling since the trial. He didn't take losing well. He hasn't been seen in town since then," she murmured. "Because men like him don't disappear. They wait." By the next evening, Evan had already begun making changes to their home. He installed 2 security cameras, one over the front porch, another angled toward the backyard gate. He upgraded the locks on both doors, added a motion light near the shed, and replaced the screen on the upstairs window Hazel often opened during summer. Nora watched silently as he worked. Max sat nearby, his gaze never far from Evan's hands or from the tree line beyond the fence. "I hate that this is happening," she said quietly. "I do too," Evan replied. "But I trust Max more than any lock." The next letter came 3 days later. This time it was left on the windshield of Nora's car outside the grocery store. Same handwriting. "A badge doesn't erase blood. You're keeping a killer. Don't forget what he did." She didn't tell Hazel, but Max knew. He grew more alert at night, rising suddenly to inspect windows, sitting for long stretches near the back door, ears twitching even at the smallest sound. During the day, he rarely left Nora or Hazel's side. Even when Hazel knelt to read him a story, he sat facing the windows, eyes fixed, posture upright, as if guarding the story itself. And then came the night. The one that began like any other. Hazel had gone to bed early after a long afternoon visit to the library. Nora had tucked her in with a soft kiss, whispering goodnight, while Max lay beside the bed. Evan, having stopped by to drop off extra batteries for the camera system, lingered in the living room for a while. They spoke in hushed tones. "Maybe it's all just meant to scare us," Nora said, wrapping her cardigan tighter. "He hasn't actually. I've seen men like him before." Evan interrupted gently. "They don't need to rush. They count on others letting their guard down." He looked at Max. "He won't let that happen." At 11, Evan left. At 1:15 in the morning, Max stirred. Nora didn't hear it at first. Just the wind outside, a distant rustling of leaves, and the faint click of Hazel turning in her bed. But Max was already at the window, ears sharp, body taut, tail still. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply watched. Then moved. Quickly. Nora sat up, heart thudding. She heard the creak of the stairs as Max descended. She followed, barefoot, pulse racing. And then the camera alert chirped on her phone. Back gate. Movement detected. She ran. The screen lit up with a grainy image, a shadow slipping past the bushes toward the back porch. Then another notification. Rear porch. Camera triggered. Max was already at the door waiting. His body leaned forward, muscles trembling, but not with fear, with readiness. Nora's breath caught. The back door creaked. A figure emerged, hood low, shoulders hunched. Something metallic glinting faintly in his hand. Then Max lunged. Not with violence, but with speed. He burst through the back dog door flap, a blur of fur and force landing between the intruder and the porch steps. Clint Redford froze. Nora saw it all through the window. Max didn't attack. He stood firm body between Clint and the house teeth bared only slightly enough to say, "Don't take another step." Clint's eyes flicked to the windows. He raised the object in his hand, a crowbar. Max took a step forward, and Clint stepped back. Then sirens. Evan had called the police the moment he saw the alert from his own synced camera feed. By the time they arrived, Clint had already dropped the crowbar and was crouched on the lawn, Max watching him with the stillness of a veteran who'd seen far worse. At the station, Clint said little. He didn't deny it. Didn't apologize either. "He's dangerous," he mumbled. "You'll see. One day you'll all see. Dogs like that aren't meant to be trusted." But the report said otherwise. The footage from the camera showed Clint scaling the fence, showed him approaching the house with a weapon, showed Max waiting, not attacking, not losing control, defending, protecting. Again, Hazel woke up the next morning to the sound of birds, unaware of what had happened. When she came downstairs and saw Max resting by the front door, she sat beside him and laid her hand on his fur. "You okay, Max?" Max blinked slowly, nudging her hand with his nose. Nora stood nearby, sipping her coffee. Her hand still trembled, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was awe. "He kept us safe," she whispered. Evan arrived soon after, looking tired but calm. He sat on the porch with Nora while Hazel played in the yard with Max, tossing a soft rope toy that the dog caught gently, always bringing it back without haste. "He didn't bite," Nora said quietly. "No," Evan agreed. "He didn't need to." She looked at him. How did he know? Evan smiled faintly. Because that's what he was trained for, feeling what others can't see, sensing what others ignore. He may not be a soldier anymore, but he's still a guardian. They watched Hazel hug Max, whispering something that made the dog's ears perk. Then Nora added, "What happens now?" "With Clint." "He'll be charged," Evan replied. "And this time, Max won't be the one on trial." Nora nodded. Then she turned to watch the yard again, sunlight bathing Hazel's curls, Max's tail swaying as he followed her across the grass. The silence returned, but it was the comforting kind, and this time it had teeth that knew when to bear and when to rest. The air in Washington that morning was crisp and golden, with sunlight brushing the marble columns of historic buildings and casting long, elegant shadows over streets that had carried the weight of history for generations. But on this particular morning, all eyes weren't on presidents or politicians. They were on a German shepherd named Max. It had started with a letter official, embossed with a seal that shimmered faintly under the kitchen light. Nora had read it twice before Hazel even looked up from her drawing. "Mom," Hazel asked, peering over curiously, "why are your eyes shiny?" Nora blinked and smiled. "Because this is something special." The invitation came from the National Council for Service Animals. Max was to be awarded the Canine Valor Medal, a distinction given only to animals whose acts of courage had directly protected or saved lives. "He deserves it," Evan had said softly when he read the letter himself. "This country owes him more than it knows." So they made the journey. Nora had never imagined stepping foot into the Capitol Rotunda, let alone with her daughter dressed in soft blue and a German shepherd trotting proudly beside her, his badge-shaped collar polished and gleaming. Hazel held Max's leash, but it was Max who led the way, steady, composed, carrying years of silent service in every stride. The ceremony was held in a sun-drenched courtyard with white chairs arranged in neat rows, a podium draped in deep navy velvet, and a crowd filled with military veterans, handlers, families, and those who had quietly been changed by dogs like Max. The MC, a retired colonel, spoke into the microphone with a voice like folded steel. Today we honor courage that wore fur instead of armor, a heart that stood between danger and innocence, and a spirit that never asked for medals, only trust. As Max's name was called, the applause swelled not polite but warm, loud, unrestrained. Some rose to their feet. Others simply smiled with tears in their eyes. Hazel whispered to Max, "That's you. They're clapping for you." Max sat still, eyes scanning the crowd, tail slow and steady behind him. Then the colonel stepped forward, knelt slightly, and placed a satin ribbon around Max's neck. The medal caught the sunlight, a gleaming star etched with the words, "For courage without command." Nora pressed a hand to her mouth. Hazel beamed. But that wasn't the end. Later, as the cameras clicked and officials mingled, Hazel rummaged in her little canvas backpack and pulled out something she had made the night before her own award. It was a paper medallion, slightly wrinkled, the circle colored in with crayon. On it, she had written in careful block letters, "Best dog in the whole universe." The ribbon attached to it was pink, bright, bold, and absolutely unmissable. She walked up to Max, reached around his neck, and slipped it on beside the official medal. It hung a little crooked, the crayon smudged slightly where her fingers had pressed too hard. But Max didn't seem to mind. Hazel knelt beside him, hugging his neck gently, and whispered, "You're more than a hero. You're mine." And for a moment, in the heart of the nation's capital, under flags and speeches and ceremony, the most important award of all was one made from construction paper and love. The photo went viral by that evening. A photographer had captured the exact moment Hazel hugged Max, both medals visible, her face tucked into the fur just below his ear. The sunlight flared behind them, forming a soft halo around the child and her protector. By morning, news outlets across the country had picked it up. From courtroom to Capitol, the redemption of Max, the hero dog. Tiny hands, giant heart. The little girl who believed in her dog. One pink ribbon, one golden spirit. Suddenly, Max was more than just a dog who'd once faced a courtroom. He was a symbol for trust, for second chances, for unwavering loyalty. Nora's inbox filled with letters from parents whose children had been afraid of dogs until they saw Hazel's story. Messages came from veterans who wrote about how Max reminded them of their own silent companions. Schools asked if Hazel could come speak. Therapists requested copies of the image to hang in children's waiting rooms. Even a senator mentioned Max during a press briefing, calling him a reminder that courage is often quiet and often walks on four paws. When they returned home, Willow Creek had changed. Not its streets or trees or quiet charm, but its soul. Banners hung across the main road. Windows were painted with paw prints and little paper hearts. The local bakery had created Max muffins, shaped like dog bones, but filled with blueberry and oats. A sign greeted them as they turned onto Elm Street, "Welcome home, Max." "We always believed." Hazel squealed with delight, pointing out every balloon and streamer. "I told you they'd be happy," she shouted through the open car window, Max's head sticking out beside her, tongue lolling gently in the breeze. When they pulled into the park, a small stage had been set up near the old fountain. The mayor stood there, flanked by townsfolk and children waving handmade signs. Today, she announced with a warm smile, "We officially proclaim this day, every year forward, as Max Day in Willow Creek." The applause that followed wasn't just for a dog, it was for a journey. A journey from accusation to acceptance, from fear to celebration, from a courtroom silence to a town song. That afternoon, families gathered with picnic baskets and lemonade. Children played fetch with their own dogs in Max's honor. Hazel led a paws parade where kids wore cardboard ears and marched behind her as she carried a sign that read, "Heroes have tails." Nora stood beside Evan near the stage, watching it all unfold, with a smile that came easier now. "Do you remember that first day in court?" she asked. Evan chuckled. "You mean the one where I thought Max's life was over?" She nodded. "I also remember a little girl who walked into that courtroom and changed everything." They turned to see Hazel curled up next to Max under a shady oak. Her shoes kicked off one hand, on his fur the other holding a half-eaten cookie. "I think they saved each other," Nora added softly. "Maybe that's what real rescue looks like," Evan replied. As the sun began to dip, painting the sky with watercolor streaks of amber and lavender, a local musician picked up his guitar and began to strum a soft melody. Families sat on blankets. Laughter echoed. The scent of grilled food mingled with fresh-cut grass. Max, now comfortably sprawled in the grass, turned his head toward the sound and blinked slowly, content, peaceful home. Hazel leaned over and whispered something into his ear. No one could hear the words, but the smile that followed said enough. Nora sat beside them, feeling the world still for just a moment. It wasn't about medals anymore. It wasn't even about justice or recognition. It was about belonging, about a little girl who found her courage in the eyes of a dog, about a dog who rediscovered joy in the hand of a child, and about a town that had somehow become just a little bit braver because of both. Later that night, after the crowd had thinned and the last lanterns had flickered out, Nora tucked Hazel into bed. "Was today the best day ever?" she asked gently. Hazel yawned, eyes heavy. "No," she murmured sleepily. Nora blinked. "No," Hazel smiled. "Tomorrow might be better. It's still Max's day then, too." Downstairs, Max lay curled at the base of the staircase. His medals, both official and pink, hung on the wall above a framed newspaper article. The night was quiet. The good kind of quiet. But somewhere out there in the stillness, something else was beginning to stir, something that would pull Max once again toward a path few could follow. It began on a Saturday morning with the scent of pancake batter and the sound of Hazel humming as she colored at the kitchen table. Nora had just poured coffee when Hazel looked up, her expression unusually serious for a girl wearing mismatched socks and glitter in her hair. "Mom," she said, placing her crayon down, "I think I'm going to start a club." Nora raised an eyebrow. "Oh, what kind of club?" Hazel grinned. "A club for people who want to do good things, for people like Max." From that moment, the Club of Good Things was born. At first, it was just Hazel and Max, because, as she reasoned, he was the first to do something brave without asking for anything back. Their meetings took place every Sunday afternoon in the sunroom, where Hazel would scribble notes in her spiral-bound notebook, and Max would lie beside her with his chin on her foot, blinking up at the ceiling fan, as if thinking deeply. She designed a logo, a paw print inside a heart, made badges out of felt, wrote a mission statement that included rules like, "Always say something kind before you leave a room, and never let someone sit alone if you can help it." By the third week, 2 of her classmates had joined. Then a neighbor's son. Then a retired teacher named Mrs. Whitmore, who said she'd always wanted to be part of something gentle. Max attended every meeting faithfully. Hazel gave him badge number 001. The weeks grew richer, warmer, not just in season, but in spirit. Hazel began visiting the local children's hospital once a week, with Nora and Max by her side. She wore her club shirt and carried a small backpack filled with storybooks and paper hearts. Max wore a therapy vest and walked calmly through the halls, his eyes soft, his movements slow and deliberate. Children who hadn't spoken in days reached out to touch his ears. Teenagers battling impossible illnesses smiled quietly when he sat beside them. Even parents found themselves resting their palms against his back as they cried, because Max never pulled away. He simply stayed. He stayed for every trembling hand, every whispered fear, every moment someone needed to believe that kindness could be real. At school, Hazel began speaking during morning assemblies, sharing stories of Max not just as a hero from the courtroom, but as a friend who waited patiently when she had bad days, who rested beside her bed when she was sick, who wagged his tail when she came home with scraped knees or a shining report card. Her classmates listened with wide eyes. Some began bringing their own stories to share. A boy talked about the time his grandmother cried and his dog licked her tears. Another girl drew pictures of how her cat slept beside her every night. The principal declared the last Friday of each month Kindness Friday, and Hazel was invited to read her club's motto over the loudspeaker: "Goodness doesn't need applause. It just needs to be real." Max was in the crowd that day, sitting at the front of the gymnasium, surrounded by posters and streamers and children waving cardboard paws in the air. One evening, as the late spring sun dipped low over Willow Creek, Nora found herself walking past Hazel's bedroom. She paused when she heard soft murmurs inside. Hazel was sitting on the floor, facing Max. "I think people forget how hard it is to just stay," she was saying, stroking his fur gently. "To stay when someone's scared. To stay when no one else will. But you stayed, Max. Even when you were tired. Even when people didn't understand." Max blinked slowly. Hazel smiled. "That's why you're the president of our club." Nora felt something stir in her chest, an ache so full it nearly sang. She tiptoed away, letting the moment remain theirs. The letter arrived on a quiet Wednesday. It came in a thick white envelope with gold lettering addressed simply to Max. Willow Creek. Nora opened it slowly, her hands trembling slightly. The header read, "National Canine Hall of Fame. Induction Notice." Below it, a simple message. "We are honored to inform you that Max has been selected for induction into the Canine Hall of Fame for his service, bravery, and continued contributions to community healing. The ceremony will be held this fall in Colorado Springs, where Max's name will be permanently enshrined among the finest service animals in history." Nora read it 3 times before calling Hazel downstairs. When Hazel saw the letter, her mouth fell open. "Max," she whispered, throwing her arms around his neck, "you're going to be in a museum. Like a real one. With your name on a wall and everything." Max wagged his tail once, then settled back onto his mat, as if sensing the gravity, but choosing calm over celebration. Nora sat beside them both, the letter still in her hand. She glanced toward the window where sunlight dappled the garden outside, and a breeze stirred the curtains. And in that silence, something began to bloom inside her memory. She remembered the very first moment almost a year ago now. A courtroom. A little girl with a voice barely above a whisper. A dog sitting still, heart beating steady. And a phrase so simple, so fragile, that it could have been lost in the rustle of papers or the shuffle of shoes. "You're my hero." She hadn't known then what would follow. She hadn't known that one quiet moment of truth could ripple outward, touching not just her life or Hazel's or Max's, but an entire town, an entire nation. Children learning to trust again. Parents remembering how to hope. Veterans believing in healing. A school celebrating kindness. A town creating a holiday for a dog. And now, a place in history. All from one whisper. Nora looked at Max and felt the weight of it, not heavy, but full, like a stone warmed by the sun. Like the kind of truth that stays even when stories fade. That fall, they traveled to Colorado Springs. The Hall of Fame was nestled in a serene grove, surrounded by pine trees and polished walkways. Inside, the names of dogs who had saved lives, protected troops, comforted victims, and found the lost were etched into walls that glowed with respect. Max's name joined them. Max K9, Valor Therapy Companion, Guardian of Willow Creek. A plaque detailed his journey. From courtroom controversy to national inspiration. From fear to family. From protector to healer. Hazel pressed her palm gently against the engraved letters and whispered, "You're home here too, Max." They returned to Willow Creek to find a new mural painted on the side of the community center. It showed Hazel holding Max's leash, surrounded by hearts, stars, and a banner that read, "Kindness walks on four legs." That night, as the club gathered for their weekly meeting, more people showed up than ever before. Children brought their pets. Adults shared memories of animals who had changed them. A woman with shaking hands read a poem she'd written about grief and loyalty and paws that never let go. Hazel stood at the front, a little taller now, her voice steadier. "This club started with Max," she said. "Because Max stayed. Because he reminded me and all of us that doing good doesn't need to be loud or big or famous. It just has to be real." She turned to Max, who stood beside her with his tail still ears alert, eyes calm. "Thank you," she said, and 100 hearts echoed the same. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the house had settled into its gentle rhythm of sleep and breathing and dreams, Nora sat alone by the window. She watched the stars shimmer quietly above the trees. Max was lying at her feet. Hazel had long since fallen asleep, her arm curled protectively around the stuffed bear she still carried on stormy nights. Nora reached down and placed a hand on Max's back. "You stayed," she whispered. Through the noise, through the fear, through the silence. Max opened one eye, then closed it again. Outside, the wind rustled the branches. Somewhere down the road, a porch light flicked off. A dog barked 2 houses over. But inside this house, this home, everything was still. Everything was whole. And in that stillness, Nora understood something she hadn't before. This wasn't just the story of a dog who had been saved. It was the story of how one act of faith so small it could have been missed had turned into a wave of kindness that reached farther than any of them could see. It was a story about staying, about choosing to believe, about never underestimating what love can rebuild. Max stirred in his sleep, letting out a gentle sigh. Nora smiled. Because in a world that often spun too fast, sometimes the most powerful thing wasn't to run, but to remain, to stay, to be the dog who didn't leave, and in doing so, change everything.